the SAR since the 1920s. When Webb came in, he had a big engine policy. And he wanted to look into larger engines for the SAR, because obviously around the time there was obviously a lot of RXs and smaller locos double heading, so they wanted big power. Along from there came obviously the well-known 5, 6, and 700 class locos, and they're all great to help with the design work, and including the 620 class. And it came to the 1940s. After the great success of the 620 class, being a light passenger engine, they were looking for another engine in a 484 configuration, and that was what to be the 520 class, and that was under Harrison. And basically, the goal for the 520 class is to be a loco big enough and powerful enough to pull passenger trains and freight at high speed, but to be able to run a 60-pound rail as well. And that was done by dropping the tender water in the coal. So it was quite a versatile locomotive. And the goals were to make it have a low-rated axle. So it could basically run where they want, and basically had the hauling power up to a 600 class with the way of it being designed, having 32,000 pounds of tractive effort. So it was a bit of a challenge for Harrison, but he was up to it. And the goal was to have a bunch of new passenger engines for the SAR, mainly running the tail and bend, but they were used all over the system. They entered service in 1943. That was 520, and there was 12 of them built. You'd notice the first 3 have the same shape as 520, and onwards from 523 to 531, they changed up the front end design on them for the looks. But that's basically the rough rundown of the 520s, and they were used right up to the end of days of steam. So they definitely got put to the test, and they definitely did their job. What Harrison did by making a loco with the right amount of power, 215 pounds of border pressure, and be able to run anywhere on the SAR network, bar the lighter rail lines under 60 pound. It was a very successful loco. It's made during a time of the war, you've got to remember as well. So it was quite an interesting time. Islington were building a lot of locos as well, including the standard Garrett, and obviously many bits for the war. So it was definitely a diamond pushed out of a hard time. 520 ran in service from 43, and it was stored in 1958. A lot of steam locos were. Then it returned to service in the mid-60s, around 64. There's some videos and footage of that coming back out. Quite a dirty-looking loco. Then it was condemned in 1969, and it was all up to the efforts of Dean Harvey. He is one of the founding members of the Australian Railway Historical Society, South Australia, and he wanted to save steam and preserve it. That's why we've got 621. It's all to him, and 520, and our RXs, and a railway and a rolling stock. And basically, in 1970, they wanted to reinstate it for RHS tours. It's sold at Mile End, and Dean had to get the money pretty quickly. I think it was around $20,000 back then, which is a lot of money to raise in 1971 or 1972. So they basically had to raise the money to restore the loco for purposes. And in 1972, it returned to special tours. It was painted in a lovely gloss black, and it was basically put under the History Trust of South Australia. Eventually, it got handed over to us, the RHS, which is known as Steam Ranger, operating arm of the RHS SA. So it took a lot of fight, a lot of money to get that loco restored and preserved, and it was quite lucky. I mean, 526, as we all know, got cut up due to problems, and they suggested we'll get 520. 523 was also preserved. That's now in the National Railway Museum.
521 is seen preparing to depart Adelaide with a Port Pirie bound train on the 21st of January 1964. The same locomotive is seen working another train bound for Port Pirie a few days later, on the 23rd of January 1964. The location is on the approach to North Adelaide, a well-known location for recording photos and film of steam on commuter trains and the occasional freight. Mile End was the South Australian Railway's main locomotive depot in Adelaide, and the stabling and lighting up of 520s were a common sight. Mile End continued to host 520s right up until the very end, when the diesels took over on passenger and freight trains on the main line. On this occasion, when Jeff Oliver visited the depot, Duchess of Gloucester and Essington Lewis are preparing to work services on the main line during the 8th of June 1968. A tour in the mid-1960s saw 526, named Duchess of Gloucester, operating to the border town of Pinaroo, where it met up with a Victorian locomotive which had worked from Oyen earlier that day. 526 would take passengers on the South Australian leg of the trip to Adelaide, but a slight delay happened when the front pony truck derailed. This meant that the train didn't arrive into Tailem Bend until complete darkness. 520 departs the railway station in Adelaide with an excursion in the early years of its life and preservation. At the location of one of the many tunnels in the Adelaide Hills, 526 heads a railfan excursion from Adelaide, bound for the branch line to Victor Harbour. After taking on water, 526 departs Strathalbyn for the run to the seaside town of Victor Harbour. The Victor Harbour branch is now preserved by the Steam Ranger Heritage Railway, which operates steam haul trains all year round. The locomotive is seen at several locations as it works through the Adelaide Hills during the 1970s. had a pretty extensive tender tank rebuild in
the
late
right.
70s, I think, 78 or something like that.
Yeah.
Which was its first issue with the tender. So similar issue to what took it out in the it was the tank that was rusted, not the chassis, that took it out in the late 90s. So that was done. There was like James said, the big lift off the axle boxes and the wheels in 82, I think, and there was a lot of stuff done with tyres and swapping around of bits and pieces there. Used a couple of tyres from 526, I think, and they made a few adjustments to bits and pieces underneath. It's never had extensive boiler work. The boiler hasn't been off since the 50s or 60s, I think.
50s. And it is a 50s boiler. It actually got a boiler swap, if I remember as well.
Yeah, so nothing extensive on the boiler, but it would have had superheater elements changed. It would have had tubes changed. I think the tubes were done in the 80s, early 80s, and the flues, and wheel turning periodically, that sort of stuff. And the big, probably one of the big ones was taking the oil burner out in 1994, I think, taking the oil tank out and taking all the burner systems out. So that was quite extensive. But apart from that, it's fairly modern in its design. So some of the issues that other older engines have, it doesn't suffer from, especially with axle boxes and things like that. So it is fortunate to have a more modern engine.
So 520 originally was a coal burner, and the SAR were experimenting with oil, and 520. It got converted to what it was actually a coal and oil burner. So it had actually a bed of coal, and then had oil burners, and that was converted in 1949. That's when it got put. So pretty early in its life, coming into service in 43, and it basically had that set up until we got it, until we changed it back to coal in 94. And I should add all the 520s did go to that setup.
Most tenders have a chassis, and then they'll have a tank on top of that chassis, whether it's welded on top of that chassis or it's bolted on top of that chassis. And they're two separate, or sort of two separate items. And when your tank corrodes away, you lift your tank off, clean your chassis up, and put a new tank on. Because they wanted to get this extra distance out of the tank, they decided to have the chassis within the tank. So the chassis is still at the bottom of the tank, but the tank extends down underneath that. So you've got the spine of the chassis sitting in the water 100% of the time. And as with the rest of the tank, it just corrodes away and got to the end of its life in 1998, I think, at the end of 1998. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that there's no easy fix for it, because it's so integral to the structure, yet it's also so integral to, or was so integral to the water tank. There's no quick fixes. There's nothing you can do. You've just got to take the whole thing apart and start again. There's two bits of pipe welded into the back of the backplate that go through into the inner firebox and into the firebed. And they just filled them up with refractory clay, but there was a requirement to cut that tube out and make that part of the boiler again. So restay it, replate it. So there was a couple of things that needed to happen there, as well as a few routine bits and pieces. And just the fact that
and Steam Ranger had only shifted to Mount Barker a couple of years prior. And when we did shift to Mount Barker, there wasn't a lot in Mount Barker, and it was a bit of a setback as far as money goes, and as far as volunteers and expertise and all that sort of stuff goes. So the resources took quite a hit, and therefore we didn't have any resources to tackle something so big. That's a massive, massive job. And so that, I think that's when it was the decision was made to put that on the back burner. And there are other engines that were easier to get going, 621 and 207 at that time, and the F was going then, and to concentrate on them and keep them running. And that was probably the right decision at the time. I don't think you could have done anything else at the time. Unless you really had more expertise and more money around, or a donor, there was probably not too many other options. So that was it for a while.
What are the, apart from the tender, what other jobs are required actually on the locomotive to get it back in service?
Yeah, okay. So the tender, luckily I think it was 2014, was it, James? The donation?
I think so, yeah, around 2014.
Dean Harvey, who's, we spoke about before, and was the grandfather of Steam Ranger and the driving force for so many years, and the reason why we're here. He had a bit of passion for 520, as a lot of people do, and how can you not? It's such a unique item, and it's got a unique appearance and a unique story, and he had a lot of passion for it as the sort of flagship of the business, and he wanted to see it resurrected. So he threw in $150,000 for, the tender was the main issue that took it out of service, so to address that main issue. And that tank went off to a place in Mount Compass called Simon Huntington. Was it Huntington Engineering? Simon Huntington runs that business. And I think they took the approach of, we're just going to have it there and we're going to sort of tear it apart and see what we can do. And they basically realised that once they tore it all apart, it had to be totally redone. And they started, the only bit that's left is the original floor, which is now no longer in contact with the water. They put a new chassis spine in, which was pretty meticulous, cutting the old spine out and fitting this new spine in, a couple of massive I-beams, and then on top of that, building the tank back up on top, and then fitting the original, I think it's called coaming, to the top of the tender there, and the original toolboxes in front of the tender back on. So putting a bit of a jigsaw back together. And that was a few years, 4 or 5 years, or 6 years, I think, in the end, to get through that process. And what Dean Harvey passed away, I think it might have been 2018, was it, or 2019, one of those years. And so that was a little bit of a change to the way things were funded, because that stream was no longer there. He couldn't put any more money in, and that donation had sort of run out. So there was a bit of a change in the way that was structured. And so that had came back, and that's all just about done. It just needs a few little bits and pieces tweaked on it. So that tender is virtually brand new. It's also been grip blasted, and it's been painted with a special paint called Interzone 50 or something like that, I think, or Interzone 90, which is a paint that can withstand not only the water but the chemicals that we put in the water. So the interior of the tank will no longer corrode. And if that's the case, and we can keep that like that, keep that coating on there, that will last indefinitely. That's just forever now. So instead of having to plan for a new tank in 30, 40, 50 years, if we can really keep that coating on there, you don't have to plan for a new tank. You can have that forever, which is fantastic. So there's that. That was done. That came back 2020. The bogies for that tender have been gone over. They had their axles all shot ultrasonically. They're all good. They've had the brake gear all serviced. Some of the suspension pins have been serviced. A lot of stuff's been looked at. New bogie centres for that as well. And so they're ready to go. The tank's on there, and that needs a few bits and pieces internally and a bit of a fit out, and that'll be ready to go. So that's almost 50% of the work. But the other stuff relates to the engine, obviously. So I think the approach we're trying to take is to do as much as we can without it, going right back to every nut and bolt. It's not a great deal. The locomotive chassis and the wheels and all the motion and that sort of stuff is in relatively good nick. Like I said before, it's got some features because it's so modern that mean that the maintenance cycle is actually lower. So roller bearing axle boxes, which just make it really simple until we have to replace them, which is hopefully a long way into the future. But that sort of stuff, all roller bearings on all axles, and all the springing's accessible, and all that sort of gear. But we've taken the boiler off, as you may know, and the major jobs on the boiler are still plating these oil burner holes up. So we've got where the oil burner used to, the oil burner pipes used to come into the firebox. They've got to be replated into the firebox and restayed. That's fairly simple. We just have to wait for our pressure vessel welder to be available in February. So that'll happen then. We've got the whole smoke box to replace. The smoke box suffered a lot from the oil burning. The effects of the oil burning are that there's quite a lot of acidic sort of soot from that process. So internally, that smoke box suffered a lot of corrosion, and also externally, it hasn't been painted or anything, so it's suffered corrosion on both sides. It would still run for a few years, but now that we've got this opportunity, it's a really good time to lock in these gains long term and replace that smoke box with one that's brand new. The material thickness is slightly thicker. It's about 0.5 of a mil thicker on the new smoke box, and it's going to be painted externally, which will negate one source of corrosion. Internally, it's a bit harder because it's quite a hostile environment in the smoke box, but with no oil burning, it should have a slightly easier run. So there's those two items. Obviously, the tubes and the flues. The flues, of which we've all got. We've just got a couple of processes to do to make them usable. The tubes we have to order this year, and they'll as unfortunately a lot of steel prices have gone up, so that's going to be quite a hefty sum. But we're going to tack some extra tubes onto that, hopefully for future, a bit of future proofing there. So flues and tubes. There's a few other things to look at. There's the firebox corners, which we had to look at on every other engine. 621s had 4 done, 207s had 6 done, 4 inside, 2 outside. 224s had 4 inside done, and 520s had 1 inside corner done. So there may be 3 inside corners to do. And the throttle valve, the regulator in the dome, and the J pipe, the steam pipe, they'll all have to be inspected. That's the boiler stuff, plus some crack testing on it. And there'll be some pipes that run from manifolds to appliances to replace fairly simple stuff like that. So there's a few items there. And then on the engine side, the main issue to look at for us is the cylinders and valves, the steam chests. Because a lot of 520 is a fabricated construction as opposed to cast, we're talking obviously the steam chests and quite a lot of the other bits and pieces. When a cast steel or cast iron to the least, doesn't corrode as much. Cast steel doesn't corrode as much as fabricated steel. So the issue, because these steam chests have been fabricated, they actually corrode at a faster rate than 621s, which have been cast. 207s, the F, 224, they're all cast steam chests. So they all last quite a long time. 520s will, if we are able to blast them and coat them. So externally they're corroding, internally they're corroding as well. So the good thing about a fabricated steam chest is you can just weld to it. So you can pad weld, you can weld new bits on, you can cut bits out and weld new bits in. So that's the upside of the fabrication. The downside is that it does corrode away almost twice as quickly, I reckon. So we've got a bit of inspection to do there, and whether that's the last remaining area that we're not quite sure of our scope yet. We've got a fairly good scope for the rest of the project. Boiler, we know pretty much what we've got to do. Tender, we know what we've got to do to finish it. The locomotive chassis and most of the bits there, we know what we've got to do. The steam chests are the only part where we're not quite certain yet. So that's one that's up in the air. The worst case scenario is it's probably not making new ones. The worst case scenario is having to take them off, take them apart, clean them all up, do a fair bit of repair and put them back on, line them all back up. Best case scenario is they're okay and we can use them straight away. So somewhere in that, between those 2 points is what we're going to find. It's really the best case scenario from my experience, but we'll go through that hopefully some point this year. And that when we've got that last area of the scope understood, then we'll have a really clear picture of how much we've got to do, and then on from that, how long it's going to take us. So that's a bit of a gist. I mean, there's a lot of information there, but that's a bit of a gist of what we've got to do, and there'll be other little things on the way. But that's the big picture.